Namaste. On behalf of Team Dharmawiki, I welcome you all to the fifth session in Dharmawiki Talks, a series of talks on various topics in the Bharatiya Jnana Parampara or Indian knowledge systems. Before we begin with the talk, here is a short video introducing the Dharmawiki initiative.
वयं पुत्रमदितेर्यो विदर्त
Dharmawiki.org is conceived as a Jnana Yajna, a platform for the exchange and preservation of Bharatiya Jnana Parampara amongst scholars, researchers, students, and the inquisitive readers. We request you to have a look at this initiative by visiting the website www.dharmawiki.org and help us spread word about this keystone project and connect us to more readers, authors, and contributors alike. You can also subscribe to Dharmawiki newsletters by visiting dharmawiki.org and clicking on subscribe to Dharmawiki newsletter button. And you can also read the older newsletters by clicking on previous Dharmawiki newsletters tab on the main page of the website as visible. You can stay connected with us through social media platforms like GeoChat, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Your support in any way possible will go a long way in taking this dharmic initiative forward. So this series, Dharmawiki Talks by dharmawiki.org that we have all assembled here for, is an attempt to reach out to inquisitive seekers of Bharatiya Jnana. It is an initiative of the IITB Honeybee Project, and we are thankful to our sponsors, the Ashok Goyal Trust and the Hindu University of America, for their continued support. The topic for today is Conceptualization of Self, Indian and Western Perspectives, presented to us by one of our senior team members, Srimati Sri Nishtala Manyamji. Srimati Sri Nishtala Manyam hails from a scholarly family and grew up in a traditional family grounded in dharmic and spiritual activities. She pursued her education majoring in genetics and chemistry for her bachelor's degree and completed her master's degree in biotechnology at the University of Hyderabad. She then went on to complete the medical laboratory studies in Southwestern Medical School, Dallas, Texas. She has received many scholastic awards throughout her education, worked for over 12 years in various capacities in pathology and vaccine development labs in the United States, all the while continuing to study Sanskrit informally until she decided to shift tracks and took up a master's course in Sanskrit at PS Telugu University. Later, she also majored in Sanskrit Sahitya in the Acharya level course at the National Sanskrit University, Tirupati. During her 5+ years of association with the Dharmawiki project, which is an initiative of IIT Bombay Honeybee Project, Under the guidance of Professor Ganesh Ramakrishnan and Professor Ashish Pandey she has been instrumental in many content and site development activities, such as developing the site policies, framework for introducing new authors, website launch, apart from contributing scholarly content on various topics of Indian knowledge systems like Vedas, Vedangas, Darshanas, Upanishads, Shastras, along with their relevance to modern society, as well as ancient Indian science and technology. She has authored many foundational articles on the website. She is also involved in preparing the curricula and textbooks for mathematics based on Leelavati Ganitam for K-12 students as part of Professor Ramasubramanian's team at IIT Bombay. She is also working towards evolving a curriculum framework and developing content for IKS-based videos in association with Anadi Foundation and IIT Madras, a venture of the Dharmawiki project. She also collaborates with the UDAN project team to facilitate translation of articles into regional languages using the translation tool. She is also involved in Dharmawiki projects to build an online Panchanga. Currently, she is pursuing her doctoral course in Hindu studies at Hindu University of America, and in association with them, she works on building glossaries. She enjoys being part of the intellectual yajna to bring out ancient values and concepts back into usage in contemporary education and society. I now request Nishchalaji to kindly begin the talk. We also request all the participants to kindly remain on mute and post any questions that they may have only in the chat box. We will have a question answer session at the end of the presentation where all the questions will be addressed. Over to you, Nishchalaji.
Thank you. Namaste. Namaste to everybody. Thank you, Valiji, for this kind introduction. The topic for today is conceptualization of self, Indian and Western perspectives. So the theme for today's talk is about the self and what are the factors that influence the self. So here we'll be looking at the Indian concept of self in a holistic way. It will include introduction and basic information about Jiva, the Atman, the Panchakoshas, Shariratraya, etc. The social self and the factors involved over there. The Western concept of self, where we discuss a little bit about the Freudian theory of the ego, and differences in both these perspectives, along with the importance of this knowledge in present-day contemporary psychological studies. We will do a comparison between ego and ahankara, the concepts of ego and ahankara, and see the relevance of this theme of self in Indian and Western perspectives. So we begin with the concepts related to self. Self is the experience of personal identity or the self-sense, which we all in general experience. It is a subjective experience termed as aham in Sanskrit, and it is the I in English language. Simply put, aham is the answer, like aham is the I in the question, who am I? And our rishis, in answering this, have come up with a description of two levels of awareness. One is the empirical level of awareness, where the subject and object distinction operates, and it encompasses all human experiences, the waking, dream state, pathological, paranormal too. The second one is the transcendental level of awareness. And here, primarily, the subject and the object distinction is totally absent. It comprises of all human experiences beyond the comprehension of the conscious waking state. It could be spiritual, mystical, transcendental. So this aham, it actually represents the being in Indian traditions, and it describes the subjective experience. A study of this transcendental self in Indian theories, which is a very ongoing subject right now. Like, many people are engaged in the study of the self in the Indian perspectives. The core of the Indian self has been observed to be the Atman. It has been called as the Atman, and or the consciousness, self-consciousness. And this is this transcendental self. So what is this self? How do we define this Atma? Well, there are many texts and many theories about volumes and volumes of books about this topic in Indian philosophy. Here, considering the simple definition from Tattva Bodha by Sri Shankaracharya, defining the Atman, we say that it is Sthula Sukshma Karana Sharirad Vyatiriktaha Panchakoshatitaha San Avastatraya Sakshi Sachidananda Swarupaha San Yah Tishtati Sah Atma. That which is other than the gross, subtle, and causal bodies, the Shariratraya, beyond the 5 sheaths or the Panchakoshas, and is a witness to the 3 states of consciousness or the Avastatraya, and in the nature existing, having the characteristics of existence, consciousness, and bliss, is the Atman or self. So here we find that the nature of self is being defined as Sat, Chit, and Ananda. And there are elements of non-self or the empirical self that constitute the causal bodies, the gross, subtle, and the causal bodies, that is the Shariratraya, the Panchakoshas, and Avasthatraya, the states of consciousness of this Jiva or the empirical self. So moving on to describe more about Atman in the first place, which along with other terms such as Purusha and Sakshi, they are also included to define the transcendental self. Whereas the empirical self, as we have just talked about, includes the terms such as Jiva, Dehin, or Kshetrajna. We find them in Bhagavad Gita also. Then a subset of this is the psychological self, which talks about like Ahankara, Jnata, Karta, Bhokta, Asmita, Anubhava, Ahambhava, etc. Now, this Atman or the self is a very special notion, very unique to the Indian tradition. And this notion of spirituality is not defined in any other, in the Western context. And this Atman, in various texts, it is expressed in various ways, as we have just seen, Purusha, Sakshi, etc. In the Mandukya Upanishad, it is described as Turiya, and it has the characteristics of being unseen, unrelated, unimaginable, indescribable, etc. It is the essence of awareness, and it is the common underlying factor or the common state, common to all the states of consciousness of a being. It is the place where all phenomenon cease, and it is described as peace, bliss, and unity. This is the self, and it has to be realized. This is the crux of the Indian traditions, where we start the definition of ourselves starting from the aham, which has both the transcendental and the empirical selves. This Atman, how is it related to Jiva? There are other Siddhantas involving Atman. Even in the Upanishads and in the Darshana Shastras, we see many theories and many ways of expression about Atman. Here we are only going to touch upon the basic understanding of Atman in relation to the concept of self. And the Upanishads do mention that the jiva is defined by the characteristics of nama and rupa. Here we are trying to understand how this jiva gets the nama and rupa that we are calling as the whole entity or the complex entity of self. So aham as self-sense at the empirical level is associated with the jiva. The jiva is a mind-body complex with the sense organs. And this jiva has one important characteristic, that it cannot survive or stay on its own. It comes alive or becomes conscious only when it is illuminated by the Atman, the transcendental self. This Atman, when it illumines on the Antakarana, which is a part of this jiva in the body-mind complex, this Antakarana, which is the mental apparatus, once illuminated by this Atman, comes alive with the sense of self, I. The feeling of I comes up, defined by aham. So this aham is associated with this jiva as a function of this mental apparatus called antakarana, and the function itself is called as ahankara. So this ahankara is the word derived from aham, and it simply refers to our psychological feelings and thoughts about ourselves in everyday. So this antakarana, Sri Shankaracharya put it out that this antakarana, along with once the aham has originated, it gets associated, the antakarana gets associated all over the body and the sense organs along with this aham, and develops itself as abhimana. And so it develops the sense of deha abhimana. This antakarana, the other three factors that are the functionalities involved in the antakarana formation is the manas, chitta, and buddhi. So manas is the processor. It is collecting all the information from the body sense organs and processing that information. Whereas the chitta is the repository of this processed information, the experiences that go along with it. And it is involved in recollecting and reproducing that memory out. The buddhi takes up this information and processes it, analyzes, and takes decisions, or is involved in the decision of the functionality of decision making. Thus, we see this aham is associated all over the body with identification or abhimana as its primary criteria. So it also has attachment as its primary characteristic. And by appropriating everything that happens within the body and denoting it by the sense, adding the sense of I over there, I am the body, I am this body, I am thinking, I am making this decision. So it appropriates all the activities of the brain and the body and labels the self sense over there. And nothing of this can happen unless the Atman illumines this antakarana. And this Atman itself is verily an instantiation of the other dimension, the Brahman. So at the microcosmic level, this whole unit of jiva with the Atman, so the jiva Atman, functions at this microcosmic level. At the macrocosmic level, we have this Brahman, who is verily said to be the cause of this Atman. Or this instantiation, or instantiation means that it represents one instance or one person, one jiva. And this is also the reason, this also explains the concept of plurality, or the formation, the existence of many creatures and beings. This jiva also has the other characteristics as defined in Svetashvatara Upanishad. Here, it includes the various levels of the gunas, the sattva, rajas, tama gunas that keep changing within the jiva. Once all this activity starts. And the other important thing is the moment the aham is born or the aham is created by the illumination of the Atman, it immediately assigns that I am this, I am the doer, I am the karta, I am doing something. I'm enjoying something. So the kartrutva and bhoktrutva activities are assigned by the aham. And the Atman has the other characteristics here. The Atman is Angushta Matra or very subtle, and it is genderless. Thus, we see how this, here it should be emphasized that the Jiva is the actual experiencer, whereas the Atma is only illumining this whole complex, the mind-body-sense complex. And it is a non-experiencer. It is experienceless, basically. Then there are many theories again involving the Brahman and Atman and expressing the unity of Brahman and Atman, or the Brahman Paramatma concepts, which we find, and that unity is best explained by this famous analogy of the ocean and the waves as given in Viveka Chudamani. Here, for a gross understanding, we can say that the Brahman is the ocean of infinite bliss, and Jivatman are these waves which keep rising and falling back into that same ocean, which are thus created and destroyed by the play of the wind of Maya. Such beautiful analogy. So, without delving more into the concepts of Brahman, Paramatman, and Atman, there is also a variation, there is a slight variation in how the Brahman, Atman, or the Paramatman are related based on the Sampradayas. But it is very, very important to understand that all the Sampradayas underlie the same concept of unity or oneness of the Jivatma, in whichever way it is achieved. So quickly summarizing the perspectives that we have just seen, we have seen how the transcendental self, which is illuminating the psychological self and thereby getting encased in this structure there, recognized by the manas, buddhi, ahankara, and chitta, which comprises the psychological self. This is again getting encased or embodied. Now we say that the Atman is getting embodied in this biological self, which is comprised of Sharira, Indriyas, Dhatus, Prana. So all the systems in the body in a complex combination. The moment this biological entity, the formed biological entity, takes birth on this earth, it immediately gets the social identity. A child born in the society is immediately defined by the varna, then gradually by the ashramas, into which the student or grihastha, etc. Then the child or the person gets the economic, national, regional entities, identities like this, based on his character, etc. Thus, we see that the sense of identity, which is the foundation of a personality in the Indian cultural setting, having come out of this transcendental core and gradually coming through this embodied form, and goes out to see the world and gets identities from there. So we can say that a combination of these four cells play in the development of a person in the Indian cultural setting. And this identity is called the bio-psychosocial, psychical, or transcendental identity. And if we see the Western perspective now about self, Due to the non-recognition of the possibility of the transcendental self itself, all discussions halt at the biopsychosocial level. So everything starts at the body, the empirical self, whom they also call as person. And the person is the name given for the self as a forensic term by Locke. We see how the term forensic itself defines the grossness of a human being, the gross form of the human being. So just like in the Indian context of empirical self, we are also talking about the gross nama and rupa, the name and form, in the Western perspective also. And it has the same kind of psychological setup, but as an undifferentiated complex functionality, functions that are involved in a whole unit. But those functions are all related to the state of awareness, or I should say that they are in the awake consciousness, not in the sleep or dream state, etc. For the Western perspectives, consider only the awake state as the true self. That's how the psychological self, with cognition, emotion, conation, or action, volition, etc., all these come into the picture to make up the psychological self. And the objects of this is the family, society, luxury, achievements, fame, wealth, success, etc., all of which are located outside of the human or the empirical self. And this is called the moment the identities start like that, that is called the social self. And this is best described by William James, who gives his description of self like this: as a man's self is the sum total of all that he can call his, not only his body and his psychic powers, but his clothes, his house, wife, children, ancestors, friends, reputation, work, land, horses, yacht, bank account. So I guess everything is almost all covered here. So quickly summarizing, the Western perspective of self, we find that the self of identity or self-sense is basically biopsychosocial identity, starting at the biological level. It goes on to the psychological level, thinking, feeling, actions, desires, dreaming, everything is in here. And all the objects are lying outside here in the social self, the house, family, sociability, etc. So if we see a comparison between the Indian perspective and the Western perspective, we found that everything starts at the transcendental level and then comes down to this physical self or the empirical self, and then goes out into the world. So there are two ways, two perspectives here. There are two paths. The empirical self with the psychological construct within it, or the psychological self involved, can either go out and look at the world and gain worldly achievements and goals, or it can go inwards and look at the transcendental or the true self. But here, when we see this Western perspective, there is only one linear path, which is always outward. With this knowledge, we have now understood what are the perspectives of Atman, or what is whether and how it relates to the Western perspective. And now we will continue and discuss on our discussion on the topic of something that is non-self, non-Atman, which include the Shariratraya, the Panchakoshas, and the Avastatraya. Next slide, please. So now what are the Panchakoshas? We have just now seen that Atman is made up of, Atman is of the nature of Sat, Chit, and Ananda, or existence, consciousness, and bliss, or happiness. It is said in the Indian tradition that happiness or ananda is the core of, or it is the original being of the human or the jiva. The jiva, as the Atman, we saw how it resided in the individual consciousness, got embodied by the jiva, and there evolved a total complex, which is now referred to as a living being or the jiva or a person, and it is designated as person in the contemporary psychological terms. And this original human nature is Ananda, according to Indian traditions. And however, it is this layer that also is in close association in with the Atman. And due to various reasons that a human being is engaged in all the outwardly activities, all these this core is masked and it is not quickly recognized. And this is due to the presence of this 5 sheets or koshas, namely the Anandamaya, Vijnanamaya, Manomaya, Pranamaya, and Annamaya koshas. The term Maya here actually refers to all pervadingness or the pervasiveness. So none of these sheets are like clear-cut, marked, and limited. They are all intermingling with each other. They have lesser delineations. But nevertheless, in contemporary psychology, each of this is characteristically called in Indian psychology as a level of awareness. And it contributes to the formation of self at different levels. So as I was just saying, that the core of the human being is Ananda, and it masks the Atman or the bliss or happiness, transcendental. It forms the transcendental core. And this is overlaid by the Vijnanamaya kosha made up of the Buddhi and the Ahankara, which is at the intellectual level and makes up the psychological self. This is again masked by the Manomaya layer, where the Manas and Chitta come into play at the cognitive levels, also constituting the psychological self. And overlaying this Manomaya is the Pranamaya. The prana is the vital force, and it acts at the physiological levels and relates to the bodily systems, the respiratory or the digestive, etc., circulatory systems. And over and above all these is the over and above the prana is the physical self, which is made up of annam or food. Thereby, it constructs the physical body. This way, we have all these 5 koshas that are very they have an interplay with each other, and they are all coordinatively working to in our daily activities. It has to be recognized that the Atman is immanent and transcendent and pervades through all the levels, and it is not just by saying that the Anandamaya kosha has masked the Atman, it does not mean that it is totally absent and it has covered and obstructed it completely. And if we move on, based on the grossness or the subtleness of jiva, we find a further classification of the bodies into three types, namely the Sthula Sharira or the gross body, the Sukshma Sharira or the subtle body, and the Karana Sharira or the causal body. The Sthula, just as we were discussing previously with the Annamaya Kosha, it is made up of Annam or food and the Pancha Mahabhutas. It is born due to the past actions, and it has an important characteristic of being the Bhoga Sharira. It is that body which endures the duality of heat and cold, etc. It is the one that goes through the karmic cycle, and because being a Bhoga Sharira, it experiences the consequences of its own karma. And this gross body is subject to 6 modifications or the Shat Bhava Vikaras, namely Asti, Jayate, Vardhate, Viparinamate, Apakshiyate, Vinashyate. That is, that this body exists, takes birth, grows, matures, transforms, decays, and eventually gets destroyed. So it is only this body that undergoes the karmic cycle, and it is the one that goes through the death and rebirth. This point has to be very clear here, because the other two shariras do not go through the process of death or decay. The sukshma or the subtle body covers all the underlying characteristics. And these definitions that we see here that I'm talking about are from Tattva Bodha once again. And this physiology, they cover all the physiological, cognitive, and intellectual processes. It constitutes of Pancha Jnanendriyas, Karmendriyas, Pancha Pranas, Manas, and Buddhi. So a total of 17 elements go into the formation of the subtle body. Then we have the Karana Sharira. This is the most unique part of the Indian tradition. And this is where the Ahankara is talked about, where all these other gross and intellectual processes are segregated out. And just like the Anandamaya Kosha, this is also a body constituted of happiness, or is said to be of blissful in nature. It is described as Anirvachaniya Anadi Avidya Rupam. And it is the cause of these two other shariras that we have just discussed about. And it is said to be the Sat Swarupa Ajnana Nirvikalpaka Rupam. So it is, the important point here is to note that it is Sat Swarupa. That means it has one of the attributes of the Atman, which was Sat, Chit, and Ananda. So here this body has the Sat. We previously saw that the Anandamaya Kosha had the element of Ananda. But in both the places, we should say that there is still Ajnana in place, because this Ajnana has come up or originated due to the Ahankara, or the Aham that we had previously been discussing, the whole and soul identity issue. So we will understand more of this in the next slide. When we look at the levels of consciousness, or the Avasthatraya of the Jiva, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad clearly states that just as a great fish is oscillating between the states of Jagrat and Swapna, just as the great fish is oscillating between two banks of a river, so also a being oscillates between the states of Jagrat and Swapna. So what is this Jagrat state? It's the waking consciousness, or it is the place where the subjective experience is highly pronounced. The person feels that I am experiencing everything and this is real. Whatever I experience is in real. That is because the identity is still at the biopsychosocial level. Whereas if we see the Swapna Avastha is the dream state. Here also the subject, or I, the subject experience is there, the I feeling is there. But the experience which he has is not a part of the real self, because as soon as he wakes up from the dream, that disappears. So he terms it as non-real. It's not a part of the real self. Now coming to the Sushupta. Here again, the Brihadaranyaka gives us a very nice analogy of a great falcon, which after flying for long hours is tired, spreads out its wings and slowly descends down to its nest to rest. So also the being the jiva, after being very tired, oscillating between these states in the world and in all these activities that he's involved, in the desires, in all the achievements, the goals, or all the psychological elements that have been in play with him. He goes into a desireless or a non-dream state. It is totally, it's as though he's a Chaitanya. But he experiences Ananda. And again, the entity of Ajnana is still attached here. The Aham is still attached. Now, how is that possible? Because he comes out of this state and says, oh, I have had a wonderful sleep. So who is that I who is experienced that state of Ananda or the state of desirelessness, where there was absolute nothing and calm and peace? So it is this Aham which is still attached, and it recognizes that it had experienced something. But during the Sushupta stage, the Aham is at a very low, insignificant stage, that it doesn't recognize or have that experience during that Sushupta stage. And this is the fundamental difference between this state and that of Turiya. And Turiya, if it can be called as a state at all in the first place, it is described as pure existence, and the differentiation factor that it is Jnanamaya, full of Ananda. It is still indescribable, and it is the ground of awareness, the base of all these three states of consciousness. That's how we can see how the Anandamaya kosha is related to the causal body. And it is actually in the Indian tradition, it is this causal body and the subtle body that move beyond death. They separated death and are also capable of taking up new body. And so that is how the Aham travels, goes on to the next body and creates the sense of Ahankara once again, and involves into karma and the karmic cycle. So it is up to the human being or the person to realize this states of consciousness. And if we see, this is the link of self and the Pancha Koshas, where we have the Annamaya and the Pranamaya Koshas as the physical self. And here this special mention of Buddhi needs to be made, where you see that an inward focused Buddhi goes to explore the Anandamaya Kosha, and it realizes the Ananda, like many of our sages and seers had. And it recognizes that beyond that is the transcendental self, or into that is the transcendental self at the core, where there is no subject and object distinction. And there it seeks that I am totally happy state. Whereas it is the same Buddhi again, when it comes outward and focused outwards, it thinks that it looks for Ananda, but it is only seeking the Sukha or the pleasure. There is this difference between Ananda and Sukha, Sukha is transient. Pleasures, they basically refer to the sense pleasures. It keeps going on in those cycles and ultimately gets tired of these conscious states, and then tries to move into that Sushupta state that we just talked about. So we have the physical self, and with the physical self, we have the Aham, and in the outward sense, that is the social self. And we just now talked about the Anandamaya Kosha being the metaphysical or the transcendental self. We have the Manomaya and the Vijnanamaya Kosha as the psychological self. So here is the interplay between the concept of self and the Panchakoshas. Quickly touching upon the social self, we have many factors or elements that go into the social self, in the making of the social self. The moment, as we just previously discussed, the moment a child is born, as per the Indian cultural context, he is born into a particular society based on the Varna, and then gradually the Ashrama Dharmas. He moves on to gain more identities, national, regional identities. I am an Indian. And then he gains more professional identities. I have a great profession. I am in the best of my, I have the best of my degrees. And educational or religious, so on. You can name the number of entities, and the elements of social self keep going on and on. Then there are the morals and the values, the Arishad Vargas, where the jealousy plays in, and or the qualities, the vices or the virtues play in to relate to the identity. And then there is also the ecological factor that brings about like consumerism or achievements, etc. You can even have regional and religious identities. So the elements can be ever growing. Then if we come to the Western concept of self, we don't have as many entities, or the number of circles here have reduced. There is just the body and the mental processes. Here also the inner core definitely has the subject and object distinction, as against the Indian self, where this subject object distinction is totally lost as the person goes into the transcendental consciousness state. So here they define it as pure ego consciousness. Some call it the center of awareness. The I is the experiencing subject, here again, similar to the Indian tradition. But all the mental processes that we find, which are well differentiated in the Indian tradition, are bunched or grouped into one. And they include both the tangible or the intangible elements, such as seeing and loving, hearing, etc. The intangible being recollecting, memory, or dreaming, etc. Other states of paranormal states of consciousness. So also they have the concepts of the Western society have the social self similar to the Indian self, but the elements are different. If we have the Varnashrama society, they have a different way, like the haves and the have-nots, etc. Or they have the sense of keeping up with Jones when they talk about consumerism. Like if one has it, other person also has to have a certain big house or worldly materialistic things. Now coming to the point of ego, this is a very special entity here. It is neither awareness nor the self, but it is that construct which, without these two identities, yet is defined by its functions and plays a very important role in the construct of the personality in the Western notions. We know that there are many concepts of the ego and many theories about the ego. Here I'm considering the Freudian principles, where Sigmund Freud defines person as a three-tiered structure consisting of the id, the ego, and the superego. So these are acting in three distinct principles. The id is closely linked to the biological processes and forms the core of the personality. And because the id is constantly looking for pleasure gratification, it works on the principles of self-pleasure. It seeks satisfaction of primary instinctive tendencies, sexual and aggressive urges that are primal forces acting inside the body. Then we go on to understand the ego, which is a development of the id, and it results due to the conflict between this instinctual urges and the external reality constraints. So it is constantly doing the reality testing, and it moderates and modulates the instinctual wishes with respect to demands of the outside world. And it is one of the elements that is in constant tussle between the id and the superego. The superego is also a development of the id, and it incorporates moral standards and cultural beliefs of the society in which an entity is living. And this produces the morality principle, which functions as the source of self-control and leads the person to perform good deeds and refrain from bad deeds. So it is the morality check here. And it is this ego which is constantly either anxious or is tense because it is trying to balance and keep checking or do reality testing against the principles of pleasure and morality. And it is, while the id is trying to push for the instinctual urges to be fulfilled and pleasure seeking, the ego tries to match it with the norms of the society and wonders if this is a possibility or not based on the reality constraints. With this background, we can understand how the Indian psychological constructs have a very great role in understanding the psyche and the psychological aspects of a person. So this is where we have the reality versus unreality, karma, jnana, bhakti, samskaras, manas, ahankara, ego, and even the principles or the methods to deconstruct this ego. So it also talks about meditation, mindfulness, etc. Here we can say that, for example, ahankara can serve as a meta construct in evaluating the self and identity as a locus of control, autonomy, self-efficacy, self-esteem, individualism, etc. There is a lot of research going on. This one paper which I have just shown as an example, Neuroscience of the Yogic Theory of Consciousness, which works towards evaluating the different states of consciousness that we just discussed. Similar is the case of the example of Ananda, where the elements of Ananda are in different koshas, or the principles involved in different koshas are evaluated to understand our own selves and how to have a self-transformatory process to get more progress in this society or to identify our true self. So if we look at the pairs of these psychological constructs, if you see that action and karma are both talking about action, but one of them is from the Western perspective and karma, as you can see, is the Indian perspective. So I would like to show how they're elementally different here. If we see karma yoga has been well defined, saying that actions are driven by free will towards self-transformation and are governed by the laws of karma. And no one can escape the consequences of karma. They have to be fulfilled. So it is driven by nature also, the law of karma. But here, if you see the same thing, in the Western perspective, action is the siddhanta around action is not yet completely defined, as there is a controversy whether it is a human ability or defined by the laws of nature. Similarly, if you look at the mind and the manas, these two elements, the manas is well studied, and the Yoga Sutras define the ways to control manas through Ashtanga Yoga. Whereas the mind in the Western perspective has not been so well studied. They do define that the mind is uncontrolled. Chanchalam hi manah Krishna, we have heard that from the Bhagavad Gita. It has been defined so long ago. Whereas the concept of mind and its constructs are not yet clearly explained. They only know that the mind is uncontrolled or something happens to it and we have to take medicine for it. But they do not know the underlying principles of what could have happened to cause this change. They may have the neuroscience relationship or the neurological analysis done, but the fundamental gap still exists that they do not or they cannot yet explain the relationship between these chemical substances and the actual thought process that has taken place. There is no means to control this transformation to higher levels of consciousness. They do not know anything about the yogic principles which have been followed since even in the Indus Valley civilization, we have seen that yoga was practiced. Then coming to the ego and the ahankara constructs, ahankara talks about the self sense, which we have been talking about in the previous slides. It is an entity. It is the origin of it has been defined. And it personalizes. Its characteristic is that it is appropriates or personalizes everything, every experience, and ascribes everything to oneself. There are ways to deconstruct it too. But if we look at the ego is that construct which is based on fundamentally on the functionality, and it is not, the origins are not clearly defined. It just is the meaning and identity that the physiological self gives to the sensory images received from the brain. And again, here, even though the elements of attachment which are common to ahankara and ego are same and driven by desires, there is no way to deconstruct. Like, the deconstruction of the ego is a complex process which is still evolving in the Western arena. If we look closer at the concept of ego, we can say that it is the manifestation of the mind, the substructure of personality, and it is defined by its functions. And this is where the fundamental difference exists between the Indian concept and the Western concepts. So the ego gives meaning and identity to the images in the mind. It is also having the attribute of attachment and brings about the I-ness. But its factors are more dependent on the outside world. For example, interpersonal relationship, learning, problem solving, or coping with challenges in a given situation. So it is not the subject, and neither is it called awareness, if we look at these elements of ego. And neither does it say that, okay, this is ego and this is a person, or it is not equal to the personality. If we look at the concept of ahankara, in the Viveka Chudamani, Shankara defines ahankara by stating that the antahkarana dwells in the body as aham with abhimana in the reflected brightness of the Atman. So here the elements or the fundamental principles describing this ahankara are given, and they are not outside the person, they are within, where it talks about where ahankara, which defines the identity, manifests the me sense or the self sense, the I, within each person and creates the subject-object difference. It is the feeling of I and mine. So it associates, it highlights an individual's relationships with things, people, places, and events around them. So that is basically the biopsychosocial associations, the sangha, or the ownership, the mamakara, attractions, moha. So all these are well defined, and they are very well placed in different parts of the puzzle. And if you look at this same ahankara develops is a reason for individuality that we see, the plurality or the plurality of personalities, the vaisishtya, feeling of uniqueness, having specific traits and individual marks. So also it is the cause of the non-I part or distinct differentiation from others. And more importantly, as discussed previously also, it is the agency or the kartrutva bhava which arises as soon as the aham is born. It is the feeling of doership and this also includes the sense of control and personal efficacy. So my levels of my work are modulated by this feeling of aham. So definitely ahankara is not equivalent to false ego, pride, arrogance, etc. Because false ego refers to ego, which is individual sense of self-esteem. Or pride here refers to an individual's feeling of deep pleasure or satisfaction from one's own achievements. And arrogance refers to the exaggerated sense of self-importance. Thus, we see the fundamental differences between ahankara and ego in these various dimensions, where in the Indian approach, we have experiences that comprehend and put together from all the states of consciousness, including awakened, sleep, paranormal, and the transcendental state, which is the difference from the Western concept. Then the dimensions are more pertaining to the identity, which includes this psychical identity. The boundaries are defined by this subject and object distinction levels only in the Western approach, objective sense self. And if we look at the approaches to study this self, this Western approach of psychoanalysis is based on an ethic approach, observability, scientific measures, quantitativeness, etc. But the Indian approach of ahankara is more of a qualitative and subjective experience. So if at this point, if we look at both the theories, both Western and they have significant contributions. One gives us the concepts and the other gives us the analytical methods. So a very good spiritual psychology or the Indian psychology or the positive psychology fields, all these are latest fields that are developing. And the core idea is about spirituality or transcendentality. And this has a range of applications in medicine, psychology, psychiatry, mainly, behavioral studies, nursing and care. For example, in terminally sick patients, how do they look at karma, etc. Then social work, trauma studies, where a lot of trauma due to colonialism, say, or due to our past activities. And so counseling and therapeutic measures can be very well applied in this context. Sociology, workplace management, and even sports. All these such broad areas of our life have the involvement of these concepts that we have just discussed about self, both empirical and transcendental. Both of them acting in coordination can lead a person and bring about self-transformative changes within him, even though he's on a path of prayas, the outwardly social life, or on the path of shreyas, the inward true, finding the true self path. In both the ways, he can apply these principles either to achieve self-actualization on the outer worldly side or self-realization on the inner transcendental side. So this is how important we should realize the study of the self is to change our own selves and to bring about changes in ourselves and the society as a whole. I conclude my talk here, and we can find more references. There are a lot of topics, a lot of papers available, and we have compiled Dharmawiki articles, the Indian concept of self. You can read more about them on dharmawiki.org, and we are coming up with more of these topics under the Vedanta category. So I would like to stop here, say thank you all, and dhanyavadas to all of you all for patiently listening to my talk. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Om shanti shanti shanti.
Thank you so much, Nishchalaji. It is we who should be thanking you for such a wonderful and a very in-depth presentation on the conceptualization of the self, starting with the two levels of awareness, empirical and transcendental, and helping us understand the different facets of the self, as in Atman, Jiva, Ahankara, as the transcendental, empirical, and psychological self, how they are interrelated yet different, bringing that out by explaining to us the different layers of the self, that is the social, biological, psychological, and the transcendental layer, which brings out a very beautiful definition of personality from the Indian perspective, which is the biopsychosocial psychical identity, as opposed to the Western perspective, where it is just the biopsychosocial identity. The transcendentalness is somewhere missing. And how you detailed different aspects associated with the concept of self by resorting to the quote of Tattva Bodha, enumerating what is Shariratraya, Panchakosha, Avasthatraya. It is marvelous how you have kind of summarized all these major concepts that are there in the ancient Indian Shastras in this less than an hour talk, like close to an hour talk, and also juxtaposing it with the Western perspectives, wherein the concept of id, ego, superego, the Freudian principles that are there, and how even the social self that exists in the Western perspective is very different from what is there in the Indian perspective, giving us a comparison of psychological constructs between Indian and the Western construct of action and karma, mind and manas, and ego and ahankara, and not stopping at that, and also giving us glimpses of what are the upcoming fields of study which are based on the ancient Indian knowledge system. I think we have all been enriched by your wonderful talk, and we are extremely thankful to you for providing us your insights and your study and sharing it with us today. We will now proceed to the Q&A session. Let me quickly go over to the chat, and I'll be reading out the questions to you one by one, and I request you to answer the same.
Yes.
The first question: can classical music serve as a tool to dissolve aham, to attain perpetual peace, eternal bliss? I mean, playing or singing some of classical ragas. This is the first question.
Yes, yes, yes. There is no doubt about that. And we have a ton of a literature on this. The Sahitya Shastra is very well equipped to deal and give us the rasa theory by Bhaskara Muni, by the Bharata Muni. And this theory definitely talks about that. And we have the Navavida Bhakti, the Vedantic perspectives about Bhakti, which can also portray this, the ways to dissolve this self, or the ego, or the ahankara, the aham. It is actually the aham, and not in the sense of this false ego or pride or arrogance, but it is the internal aspect of it. So yes, definitely, classical music is one of the number of ways that we have to dissolve this aham or deconstruct the ego.
Thank you so much, Nishchalaji. Moving on to the second question. How does the absence versus presence of a transcendental element to the self, that is West versus East, affect or shape our notions of ethics, morals, and ownership? How does presence or absence of transcendental element affect notions of ethics, morals, and ownership?
Okay. Here, the ethics, morals, and the notions of dharma, the purusharthas, etc. These are some constructs that we have for the past the millions of years that the Indian traditions have been going through. So fundamentally, they are built in within our systems, and the concept of aham, which has the quality to appropriate all the activities of a person, definitely has this as a limit to cross-check its activities. The person's activities are referred and cross-checked with these principles or the purusharthas that we have, the dharma, the morals, the vices, and the virtues, which are imbibed and inculcated within every child through the samskaras, which I have talked about in the very first session about samskaras and how they relate to our social self, how it can modulate our feelings, and it teaches us how to control our emotions, or it teaches us how to regulate our activities, how to talk, and how to have that vinaya as a student, how to have the dana guna or the sense of charity as a grihastha, how to learn to withdraw from the society in the vanaprastha. And it also teaches us how to renounce everything and learn to renounce the body itself in the sannyas ashram. So definitely the element of it is, unless you have this transcendental self concept within your understanding, you would not want to go through these 4 levels. So they are definitely interconnected with our varnashrama systems. They are interconnected with all the textual descriptions of the mind that we have. where the vices and the virtues are very clearly defined. It is only our free will that we have to exercise to either choose the good or the bad. So in this concept, in this way, that it is very clear in understanding that the transcendental self pushes us, nudges us to find our own real self, because just as that bird, that great fish which was going through both the banks, and it gets tired. So also a being gets tired in this world, and he learns to find where the true self is, either in this lifetime or in the future lifetimes. It is dependent on his karma and his circumstances. So it is not, it is one way or other. It is the ultimate way that a person takes, whether or not he knows about it or he doesn't know about it. The sooner he learns about it, the better. That's all is about the importance or the significance of this transcendental self. I
Beautiful.
hope I have answered your question.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Nishtalaji. I also would like to address the question on written material. Whatever Nishtalaji has presented today, she has also beautifully written them as articles on dharmawiki.org. So I urge you all to visit www.dharmawiki.org and read more on the concept that she's spoken about today, on the article Indian Concept of Self. We also have articles on Jiva, Atman, Brahman. We have a vibrant category of Vedanta. Many of the articles which have been authored by Nishalaji are available there for you to read and explore. This is the category of Vedanta that you're watching. And all these are the different pages in this particular topic. I also request you all to kindly fill the feedback form which has been posted on the chat, and you'll be receiving a participation certificate once you fill the feedback form. We also have a question on the lecture being available on YouTube. We are planning to eventually get the lecture available on YouTube. We urge you all to kindly subscribe to Dharmawiki newsletters so that you will be informed of the next forthcoming talks, as well as all the updates that happen on the website with new articles, new topics. All that will be sent to you on the newsletter. Please also subscribe to our YouTube channel, Dharmawiki Bharat, so that when the talk is uploaded, you can take advantage of listening to Nishalaji's wonderful presentation once again online. Thank you so much, Nishalaji, today for giving a wonderful presentation.
I thank Dharmawiki for giving me this opportunity.
That is it. All the questions have been answered. And we have also posted a feedback form, which we request all of you to kindly fill and receive the certificates. And we thank Nishtalaji for taking time out and sharing all her readings and thoughts and knowledge with all of us today. And we hope to see you all next month for the next Dharmawiki talk, which is on Dinacharya, which will be on the 10th of June, same time, 4 p.m. Dinacharya, Dharmik Evam Ayurvedic Anusandhan. Please subscribe to our newsletters to get updates regarding these talks. Thank you one and all for your patient listening. We close the talk for today. Thank you.
Thank you all. Namaste.